water usage in the oil and gas industry is getting more and more scrutiny all the time. And Clear was fortunate enough to be part of the area-based regulatory panel that was convened to look at alternative water management strategies and practices and develop a series of recommendations to provide to the government of Alberta, and hopefully a pathway to implementation. So today, Scott Miller, the area-based regulation director with the AER, and Catherine Sinex, formerly a policy advisor with Chevron and now the asset manager for Liard-Kitimat, and Gavin Law, our manager of technical and regulatory services, have kind of joined forces to put this presentation together. So I'm hoping that it's good. I know that it's going to be very informative. We ask that questions are kind of held to the end. They're going to be around afterwards, and you can have more informal conversations with them at that point in time. So without taking up any more of your time, I'll pass the mic on to Scott.
Thanks. I'm the Director of Area-Based Regulation for the Alberta Energy Regulator. Area-based regulation was a concept we put forward a year and a half ago in response to a number of drivers. Primarily the shift from conventional development onto unconventional development with larger footprints, larger impacts. You'll probably remember some of the work on the unconventional resource framework and play-based. Those were all precursors to what we moved into with area-based. The second driver was also around the cumulative environmental piece, but the main difference between area-based and some of the previous exercises was this focus on stakeholder engagement and trying to build in this collaborative engagement approach so that we could actually bring a number of parties together. Next slide, please. This is the concept that we put together. It kind of comes across as relatively simple because fundamentally there's an information side and then there's an engagement side. The blue diagram on the side, the blue box, that's around having really good information around the environmental condition and the associated geology. So we actually tried to do some work through this pilot of putting those two pieces together. And then we're trying to enhance how we're collaborating with Indigenous communities and stakeholders. That's a new piece for the AER. It's not something we typically do when we build regulatory requirements. Next slide, please. So we kicked off the ABR pilot approximately a year, I think it was early 2016 when we started down this road. The idea was to test two aspects of that area-based concept, which we just showed you. The first part was to try and put together an integrated area assessment. In our case, we looked at the geology and we looked at water resources in the area. And then we also kicked off two collaborative engagement processes. So this pilot was fundamentally around testing the ABR concept, testing whether we could generate content that was suitable for regulatory change through a collaborative process and using this integrated information to drive some of that. And we certainly learned a lot along the way. Next slide, please. So we struck the multi-stakeholder panel. I mentioned there were two panels. One was an Indigenous panel, but the second, the one we started first was a multi-stakeholder panel. Its focus was water use by the energy sector in the MD of Greenview. I should point out that the MD for us was a very deliberate pick because it sits entirely inside one regional planning area, so it aligns well with the Government of Alberta planning processes. And we went multi-stakeholder. The main piece that I wanted to point out from this list is we have municipalities included. Typically, municipalities are not part of an engagement. They're not engaged as another land manager the way we engage them, and they were an extremely valuable part of our discussion. Next slide. So the panel, the multi-stakeholder panel, along with Government of Alberta, we actually had the GOA alongside us on this one, explored the water use, some of the water use issues up in the MD relating to unconventional. We put together a report with 23 recommendations, and we had an extra recommendation that went directly to Department of Energy. And I think the panel ran for 10 months all told, so we did 10 trips to Fox Creek. All of these meetings were held in Fox Creek. And we achieved consensus across all of these recommendations. Now, one of the pieces that I'm sure everybody here is interested in would be the implementation, what's happening with these recommendations. So as Catherine and Gavin sort of speak to some of the specifics of the recommendations, I will try to pipe in with what I do know on implementation and try and fill in that picture as best I can. Gavin?
So Catherine and I are going to go back and forth between the 23 recommendations. We'll try and go as quick as we can. Some may pertain more so to others, and obviously some will not. You can go in. There's primary recommendations and secondary or supporting recommendations. And so the primary recommendations, sorry, I'm gonna grab that. So the primary recommendations, they cover three main areas. It talks about the barriers to the use of alternatives and then approaches to basin management and implementation. Supporting recommendations talks about data, compliance, and communications, as well as supplementary opportunities. We're going to jump in. I'm going to pass this one along to Catherine, this next slide, to talk about risk-based. She's quite interested in this particular one.
So this was part of the framework. When we talked about our primary recommendations, there were sort of subcategories within that too. We had a lot of recommendations. We had to organize them a couple different ways. So one of the main areas that I think impacts a lot of people in this room was really around the regulatory barriers to using alternatives to high-quality non-saline water. So this framework is in the report. And actually, just a show of hands, has everybody had a chance to read the report? Yeah? Quite a few of you. So it was published quite a while back, actually. We don't want to admit when, I guess. August of last year. So, some of it's maybe becoming a distant memory, but this was heading up the report just to help frame that regulatory barrier piece. And there's a couple things that I think this chart is important for. One of them being, you can see that there's actually not a whole lot of alternatives. Right? We don't have this big laundry list of 30 different alternative places we can be looking for water. It is pretty limited. And then another thing you can see, and forgive us, they're kind of coded in here, and there's obviously a lot of material behind what these words mean on the slide. But you see that there's a lot of repeated recommendations that really do impact multiple alternative water sources. So we have some barriers that are impacting multiple sources. The other piece being, if you kind of scan across, which is each source is a row, so if you look across a particular source, you can see often there's multiple barriers impacting that source. So one of our key messages here was, if you want to enable a source, oftentimes you have to solve multiple regulatory barriers. So our message back to the AER and to the government was, don't go solving one of these and say, well, there you go, I've waved my magic wand, industry, why aren't you using more alternatives? We can always go back to this chart and say, well, because there's a few other things in the way. So it really does have to be looked at holistically. The report is meant to be looked at holistically. Okay, next slide. All right, so the remainder of the presentation until we get into some of the implementation piece is really marching through those 23 recommendations. And I'll forewarn you, the primary ones really will give more emphasis to here because I think they will be of more interest. So risk-based fluids management, this one is probably near and dear to a lot of hearts here. What we're talking about here, you can read the words, develop a risk-based full life cycle fluid management framework based on fluid chemistry. So what we're getting at here is today in the regulations, when you're looking at how the regulations apply, it generally points back to the source of the alternative. So you're really bound by regulations that are quite obsessive about where the water came from, rather than looking at what the water actually is and what the chemical makeup of it is. So this recommendation is really around how do we look at what that water is and handle it according to the risks associated with that particular chemistry, and step away from being too worried about exactly where the water came from. We had a number of examples of, Gavin could speak for ages about treating water from an undesirable source to, I'll exaggerate a bit, drinkable standards, right? But still not being allowed to release it into the environment. How do we get into a place where we're handling things according to their risk? Gavin?
So above ground storage is one of them. And going back to the risk piece that we talked about is right now there's a restriction when in D55 for volume, 3,000 cubic meters, as well as there's an issue for time, 1 year. I guess for the availability of alternatives, that's an important piece because if you have to get rid of that water within an X amount of time, there's no way that you can save it potentially for upcoming operations. Now, if you were to get rid of the volume barrier and if you were to get rid of the timing barrier, there's more alternatives to use out on the landscape. Now, of course, this would be pockmarked volumes, but available to use, but it'll be something that, well, it will provide value, I suppose, rather than just going to water. Sorry, I'm just going to grab that.
Sorry.
The other one is temporary surface lines or lay flat hose. Now, right now you can only transfer water, and you can only transfer water of a specific chemistry. To be able to open this up to a risk-based scenario where you could end up having something like a waste, for that matter, with equivalent chemistry to water, to be able to put through that pipe. From that, you would determine whether or not you have the appropriate pipe and the appropriate protection in place to be able to move that water. Now, what if that water had a bit more spice to it, I guess would be the best way to put it. You would end up putting in additional protection. There would be additional measures that you would have to end up taking. But it wouldn't restrict you from completely not being able to use it. Waste is an important definition as well. Anything that goes into the pipe cannot be waste. It's got to be water. But if you open that up, then you have a raft of fluid that you can move through that pipe.
And not to go backwards, because I know we're trying to go forwards, but one thing I wanted to mention is the temporary surface hose recommendation. You can tell it's kind of a subset of that first recommendation, right? Risk-based fluids management. And there is a reason we called it out separately. We wanted to give it a little momentum. It seemed like a quicker thing to resolve and to move forward with as an example of taking that risk-based approach. Actually, just to go backwards more, the risk-based fluids management, the thing I forgot to mention is that also impacts any situation where you might be commingling. So if, currently if you have a freshwater pond and you add a drop of produced water, you have to be designing that, you have to be following the regulations for the nastiest substance, right? 1 drop pollutes the whole pond. But again, it's like, how do we look at that chemistry and how commingling impacts that to be using that risk-based approach? So now I'll move forward, not forward slides, but to the subsurface mineral rights conflicts for alternatives. The situation we were looking at there is there's a number of situations where there's deep aquifers where the mineral rights might be held by a company, but the hydrocarbons are not being actively pursued. And some of those are alternative water sources that could be used in the Duvernay. There's sort of a whole bundle of issues around accessing that water if you are indeed an operator who would like to access that water but doesn't currently hold those mineral rights. So this recommendation was around looking into how to break that logjam to enable access to those deeper sources. Oh, this is me. Sorry, I'm back. Low-risk interbasin transfer for consumptive use. So there's some scary words in here. Hey, interbasin transfer, are we allowed to say that out loud? And I actually want to sort of revisit something that Scott was talking about, just teeing this up. Think about who was in the room. Think about that multi-stakeholder panel with people representing the town, people representing the watersheds, people representing, yes, industry, people representing government, coming out with a recommendation that talks about interbasin transfer. So there's a number of things this is, and there's a number of things it isn't. It's not, hey, let's allow interbasin transfer willy-nilly all over the place. It is very carefully thought of. You'll notice the word low risk. So what does that mean? We talked about situations like subsurface sources, those same deep aquifers that don't conform to surface basin expressions. Why would those types of sources that are not competing with other users, but still might be qualified as fresh, low-quality non-saline water, be subject to these same interbasin transfer restrictions? Also, we had a number of examples, and I'm sure you all have a number of examples of times when the restriction on interbasin transfer could actually cause a worse environmental net effects decision to be made. So, stakeholders were all behind this. We should explore how we can enable this in a measured way under certain circumstances. Basin regulatory framework. So this one was kind of interesting. This is really talking about how do we look at whether an area is actually running into allocation issues or whether it has plenty of water for all. So the government in particular was quite interested in saying, well, how do we allow business to go on, allow people to secure term licenses when there really is no issue, but at the same time have some sort of mechanism for when we are getting over allocated in a basin or getting near that point or seeing that on the horizon, that we can start looking at enhancing requirements. So this recommendation in my mind is really a suggestion for an ongoing discussion. We didn't actually frame anything out here. The recommendation was for a multi-stakeholder group to go and frame it out and meet these interests in a sensible way. So ideas that were swirling in this space were, if you got to some defined point of allocation versus availability, to start, for the government to start looking at, are you sharing water? Are you pursuing alternatives? What does that look like when they consider applications for term licenses? So I think this is really, from my perspective, it's really one to watch and see how that conversation emerges and to be involved in that discussion. Now it's Gavin's turn. Sorry.
So the multi-operator water plans, this has to do with operators within a specific area sharing, really. When it comes to sharing water, obviously you all know that's extremely difficult to do at the moment. In industry right now, there's examples of water sharing initiatives that are taking place, for instance, FCOG in Fox Creek. Now, every time that word was said as part of the meeting, there was a gentleman as part of the Fox Creek Council that would boo that every time. I guess he wasn't a big fan, but we won't say anything past that. That is an example of what one of these MOPIs could potentially turn into, or use it as a framework to implement a multi-operator water plan. Now, what the AER and AEP are looking to do is that they're looking to put some regulatory oversight on this, because you are in a competitive space, and it's something that everyone may not play exactly as nice as they should, I suspect. So I would guess that the AER and AEP would, sorry, am I saying something?
No. Go on.
So there is, I guess what the plan would be is that there would be rules and regulations that would be put into place to ensure that everyone was coming to the table, and as well as that for industry initiatives, it would be something to bring into the public eye to say that we are moving away from high-quality non-saline water into a more alternative sources, and we are trying. So withdrawal restrictions. Withdrawal restrictions, what they're looking to do is that they're looking to restrict water being removed from critical fish habitat, is what the primary is. So Strawler Stream Order 1, 2, and 3, as well as Class A water bodies, or water courses rather. Now, in the MD, this accounts for roughly 1.3% of the water that is presently allocated alone. Now, it's not a huge amount of water, but in the scheme of things, that's about 2.3 million cubic meters. The thought is that they can end up restricting these particular streams and not cause that big of a kerfuffle, but I suspect there will be some operators that are using those streams for things like not water course crossings exactly, but ice bridges, ice roads. You're looking at HDD water amount, so small amounts, but still, if you have to travel pretty far to get a small amount of water, it does end up hitting that bottom line pretty hard.
So to be clear, we made sure there were some words in there around allowing those small uses. So this isn't a restriction altogether. Those small uses are still enabled.
And then the last one was withdrawal locations. So on withdrawal locations, it has to do with, if there are multiple operators that are looking to use the same water body. What the thought was is that they would be pushed to a single area that would be used by multiple folks. It would be constructed, it would be monitored, it would be something that could be controlled. Now, I can see a considerable amount of problems associated with this. Traffic would be one. You would probably have traffic jams like nobody's business. And then if there are 4 or 5 or more operators that are using that single source, what's the liability when a spill occurs, if it does? Now, what this recommendation, why it's in here, is because this is a stakeholder concern. So the folks that live and recreate in this area have driven by vac haulers that have dropped a hose into places where they shouldn't have been, or looks like they're causing some environmental concerns. And this was one of those main points. So that's why industry, well, I guess what it boils down to is that you're being regulated to the lowest common denominator, is really what this boils down to. On to Catherine.
Regional plans. We recommended that a regional plan be created for the Upper Peace region, and these are not small efforts, as I think you all know, but it was really a little bit disorienting at times having these discussions around orderly development, knowing that there was no plan in place to point to. So everybody across the board was really quite passionate about this getting a little bit of a jump start and moving forward in a timely fashion. That said, it will still, even if it started today, it would be years before it was in place.
So alternative reclamation options. Now this has to do with operators creating large water bodies to support their operations. And what the thought was is that why would we need to fill the hole? Why would we just turn it into a wetland and be done with it? There's no avenue presently in the AER that allows that to occur. Now, the AEP's policy implementation for wetlands, they're making changes here this year, and they're implementing a construction directive as well as a construction guideline. So something like that may act as an avenue or a pathway for the construction of these pits to be, well, constructed in a way that it can turn into a wetland while you're using it operationally. Typically what would happen is that these larger water bodies would exist as a borrow pit, then the reclamation would start once operations are completed. But what that does is you have 3 to 4 years of lag time to be able to watch this thing grow back. 4 years at a minimum of you having to, before you can actually consider it a functioning wetland, and then you have 10 years that it's on you. You're liable for 10 years for that particular site. So I'll be curious as to what it looks like from the construction aspect, but we'll see in 2018.
Municipal water priority. So I'll answer the burning question before it's asked. Nobody's recommending or suggesting that anything's happening to FITFR. FITFR is a bedrock principle. It's not going away. The suggestion here, and this is truly, you'll notice there's a real mix of recommendations for policy change, regulatory change, guidance. This one I would say is a suggestion that as a gesture of good faith, companies voluntarily put in a clause saying that municipalities will have water priority in the case of water shortage. So this is not a requirement, but again, a number of companies are already doing this. I don't think if any company did it, it would be good for anyone in industry. If there was a water shortage, Fox Creek was shipping in water and we were taking it for industrial use. So this was definitely near and dear to some stakeholder hearts and something that seemed like the right thing to do. So I promised that as we went through these, we would go through a little quicker, and this is going to be the first example of that. So policy approval, there was a lot of consensus that we should get the water conservation policy for upstream oil and gas approved and in place. Partially managing to a draft is probably not ideal in the long term, so that's really quite critical. Implementation response, so again, this is sort of just the mechanics of the team. So the panel was quite adamant that we would really like to be connected with how this unfolds and how implementation is occurring. So we did request that there be ongoing report outs. And then ABR pilot implementation. So what this one's talking about is a number of the recommendations are really for regulatory change. And so unless that regulatory change occurs, the thing we're asking for is not allowed. So as a way of recognizing that regulatory change takes time, the suggestion was, or the recommendation was, is there some sort of mechanism where we can pilot these concepts early to help demonstrate that the regulatory change is good and knit that into the regulatory change system to hopefully make it occur quicker? So it's really just a way of saying these recommendations make sense. If these situations arise before the change is complete, how do we hitch our wagons to that and actually become enabled immediately? Just a sec. It's Gavin.
So advancing winter in-stream flow science. And we'll go through these recommendations a bit quicker. Really what this boils down to is that right now there's not that many real-time flow monitoring that's being captured across Alberta. Actually, in the MD of Greenview, it's all estimated here presently. There was concerns from stakeholders that having the ability to remove water under estimations rather than real data is not good, I guess is the best way to put it. So what the ask was is to implement more monitoring stations along rivers, as well as provide more information about what exactly happens under the ice if you're removing water from a lake, for instance, and what sorts of impacts, which is something that has not been addressed, especially when it comes to approving under the desktop method. Standardizing and public reporting metrics. Now there is already an avenue to provide volume and level measurements into WERS, I guess you could say. But those aren't the only two guidelines or conditions as part of any of the licenses that you guys know. There's also flow restrictions. You can't pull unless you meet this specific flow, or you can only flow at this particular rate. What the thought of it is that to potentially make a more robust system to send information into the AER, that would end up proving that the conditions are being met accordingly. Amending temporary diversion licenses. Right now, this is a pain in the behind, is the best way to put it. So if you were to apply for a temporary diversion license and it's issued, if you see that a mistake has been made or if there's something that should be updated, that license has to be canceled and then reissued. Now, aside from a paperwork burden in the beginning before even doing any diversions of water, it's not such a big deal. But when you do a diversion under that TDL and it's canceled, and then you end up getting into a situation where you have another TDL issued, that allocation is double counted. And it ends up counting towards a very large number when you're looking at allocations across Alberta. If you look at industry, so in 2016, the amount of water that was allocated in Alberta is 1 billion cubic meters. Of that, 223 million cubic meters was used. Now, from a stakeholder standpoint, 1 billion cubic meters of water is pretty terrifying. But what that also means is that if you're only using 22% of that water, how can the estimations be off so poorly when you're applying for TDLs and water in the first place? So it's a matter of shoring up the numbers, and I think it's from all sides. It has to do with the original request for water, the systems itself that are actually tracking water, and just the ability to have the AER provide information to stakeholders. And then the unused allocation review. The unused allocation review, this is a matter of going and clawing back allocations. So not specifically for allocations that haven't been used within 1 or 2 years, but it's allocations that have been around for a long period of time that haven't been touched. Or the company is defunct, or the folks just are no longer in Alberta, for that matter. So what the look of it is that the government would go and they would examine all of the allocations within the province, and they would say, you know what, you haven't used it in a while. Do you have a need for this water? Of course, it's going to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, but so you're not going to get in trouble. They're not going to take the water away from you. But it's something to be mindful of because it will end up shoring up those numbers quite a bit. Because it could be that a large chunk of that 1 billion cubic meter allocation is just totally unused.
Perfect. The system works. All right, the next one's on streamflow monitoring. So, this connects back with one of the recommendations Gavin talked about, but there was a lot of angst around the science that exists today and just how well we know what's actually happening. And a lot of the people, a lot of the stakeholders actually who are very connected to the area and spend a lot of time on those roads and doing their own thing, right, recreating and enjoying the space, a lot of them are very familiar. You know, they're fishing, they're very familiar with the river conditions and the stream conditions. And some of that didn't really connect with some of what the science on the surface was saying. And their comment was, well, there isn't enough monitoring, it's not in the right places. So the recommendation that we were able to come together on was, how do we get that to where it needs to be? How do we assess the monitoring as it exists today and shore that up so that in the future when we have this discussion, we have good science that we can point to and we can all have the same facts to work from. Compliance and education. So this also connects back to something else Gavin was talking about. You know, there were a number of stories about various stakeholders seeing companies taking water from areas that they were not comfortable with. And a number of those discussions really uncovered that that activity was probably not actually allowed. And we got into a lot of really muddy discussions around, I don't like it when this happens. Well, that's not actually allowed. Okay, then how are you making people comply and making sure that people are not, companies are not doing activities that are not allowed? So this was really around how do we shore up that compliance and also the education effort, just to make sure we are following the rules that exist. And we're not getting into a conversation about changing rules if the rule itself is sound. The compliance is really the issue. Site signage. This one's really about modifying the regulation to require posting in a more visible way some of the information that we already have available at site. So again, a number of the stakeholders said, well, fine, you know, you have this information available, but then it's on me to go to somebody conducting the activity and ask them for the information. And they were just, a number of people were uncomfortable with that and thought it would be more effective if it was visible. You know, I'm looking around, nobody has anything to hide. We do have the information available, so it seemed like a pretty minor fix to enable stakeholders to see it, for it to be visible, you know, really to circumvent some misunderstanding right out at the beginning. And then single information source. There were a number of conversations that were really around misunderstandings of the facts and also unequal access to information. There were a number of times where companies said this is the way it is and we report this information into the AER, and stakeholders said, well, that's great, but I can't see it. I have no way of accessing that data and I have curiosity around this space, or I'm creating my own stories around what's happening with my observations and I don't have access to the facts, right? So we thought it was really important to bridge that gap and make sure everybody has access to the same information. And I'll leave it to Scott to talk about the implementation. Okay, so this is my slide as well. Now we're going to talk about lessons learned and current status. All right, lessons learned. So I think there were a number of successes in this process. Scott mentioned all the quality time we got to spend together in Fox Creek. That was great, but you know, I really do think if you dig into that and the way the AER in particular and also their co-facilitators, the AEP, chose to set up this process, it really was, we had a ton of face time. And that face time was really critical to us reaching common understanding. Many participants commented that of all the initiatives they'd been part of in the past, there was deep mutual respect, there was a lot of listening, there was a generosity in educating, each of us educating each other, and also a willingness to be educated. I think that atmosphere really allowed us to go into some spaces. You can see some of these recommendations are in some contentious spaces. And I think we were able to get into the nuance, really examine our thinking, and reach common ground together. So I really think there was a little bit of magic, AER magic in that process, which was nice. And we did reach consensus on all the recommendations. It wasn't false consensus, it wasn't yes and, it wasn't, 14 of us are on board. It was actual consensus. And we worked them until everybody was comfortable. A new inclusive approach, I suppose that is what I was talking about before. So I I definitely think the process itself was very positive. Areas of improvement, I think we're all eagerly waiting for the results, but I won't steal Scott's thunder. We did, I think the second bullet is extremely important here. There were a number of instances where there was a lot of energy and support for piloting and implementing early and being agile and really coming out of the gates strong. And we ran into a number of issues where there was some sort of policy barrier that really meant that early implementation or piloting of a concept was equivalent to breaking the law because it was in policy. Therefore, we couldn't go into that space. So I think having a little bit more clarity up front on where we were treading in that territory to keep our expectations in check over what some of these implementation journeys would look like would have been positive and is something that the AER can carry into their future processes. Speed and ability of implementation, I think a number of these topics, Scott alluded to when this process started. It's already becoming a bit of a distant memory. And it was already over a year ago. A number of the issues that we were talking about and raising in that room were happening then and were urgent. Or there were a number of items on the horizon that were decision points for individual companies or other companies that really needed to be informed by this work. So as with all things, I think the longer the implementation waits, the more we get into a story of diminishing returns. I also wanted to add one. If you'll recall Scott's diagram at the beginning, sort of framing up how this initiative was different, there was the blue box around the science branch. And I think there's a bit of a pacing issue where when we started this process, we were really hopeful the science branch and the work that they're conducting in this space, the really good detailed work in the MD, understanding the water situation, we were really hoping that information would be available and ready to inform this stakeholder process. And in fact, they're a little bit out of sync. So I think we're seeing a little bit of rub points between the conclusions being reached on that side and the conclusions that were reached in this room. So I think just more coordination and more syncing up would be helpful. But now, that he's thoroughly queued up, I'm going to let Scott talk about the status. You're welcome.
So is this the part where I say I don't know anything about implementation?
Hopefully not.
So as Catherine mentioned, when we kicked this process off a year and a bit ago, the idea was to test a collaborative process in the science piece, and she did a really good job of describing some of the barriers that we hit. I would have to say when we put this project together, and I was part of that process, at that time we very purposely scoped implementation out of what the ABR project was. We felt we could take the content that came out of this and pass it into our existing regulatory development process. That was a place where we screwed up. That was a place where in hindsight we can see that the transition from a team that has been in-depth discussions in the field with a number of stakeholders, transitioning that body of information over to another team that doesn't have that background and has to get up to speed is a huge challenge. That being said, we have kicked off it's now called a water conservation policy project. It's intended to deal with a number of these recommendations, but basically it's being driven by the government of Alberta asking us to create the regs. The material that we created at the ABR team, or with the ABR multi-stakeholder panel, is a key foundation for that work going forward. So to give you an example, the risk-based fluids management recommendation, the above-ground storage, the temporary conveyance, the temporary hoses, the multi-operator water plans, those are all part of this project that has been kicked off, and it's actually being led by our regulatory development group. They are in the process right now of doing their standard regulatory analysis, and they're looking to have that work done by March. They're looking to have whatever it is, the directive or whatever the instrument is, done by the fall. because of some of the direction they were receiving back from the ABR team, they are now looking at whether or not they can put pilot applications into their development process. So can we test a few of these things? They're figuring that out. I think they're going to be looking at some of the storage options and possibly some conveyance. And you should be hearing a little bit about that in the near future as they sort of pull that work together. One of the key things that we learned and talked about as a panel was this notion of different risk categories of fluid. So we talked about how we regulate today to the highest risk, and that there's ways to reduce that risk. That's a concept that's being built into the Water Conservation Policy Project, and that's what's happening right now. Are we going as fast as all of you would like us to? No, we're not. To some degree, we lost some ground because of the transition. That being said, this project is actually trying to accelerate their work so that they can sort of catch up and fill that gap a little bit. By design, and it was a flawed design, let's say, from that piece around not having implementation, that actually has caused us some issues. The other pieces that are moving, some of the smaller pieces are happening at sort of different paces. We have the site signage one as an example. That one's complete and done. The examination of the water for stream flow monitoring network, that's kicking off. That's actually being led by Environment and Parks. And you'll actually probably hear, we haven't quite got to the point where we're bringing in the industry subject matter folks, but that's the intent, so we can do the assessment of that basin. A couple of the other pieces, some of the reporting pieces, we've actually, you've seen our water use reporting report that we've now posted to our website. That's the first iteration of an ongoing evolution in that. That speaks to a lot of the pieces that Gavin spoke to around, okay, duplication of allocations, record keeping. We had to clean all that up even to do that report. We've tested that in the MD of Greenview, and it'll go wider than that, and we'll probably end up going to a company level at some point in the future. And I expect it won't be just water use, it'll also end up being land footprint and all of these other environmental pieces. The key one that Catherine spoke to on the basin management framework, that's a piece of work inside our shop. We're calling it cumulative effects management. It's essentially the same thing. We're building out our environmental sciences group and adding some analytical capacity. That's happening right now. And that group is actually looking at a project. They're actually putting together their project right now to come out and have the very discussions that Catherine talked about around at what levels do we start to see the risk change on the landscape in relation to water use, and what kinds of requirements might we tie to that, whether it's increased reporting, whether it's more collaboration amongst industry, et cetera. I know we only had the one slide on implementation, and I wasn't planning to go through all of these recommendations individually, but the bulk of these large primary recommendations around barriers are being handled inside the Water Conservation Policy Project. It's my understanding that the policy itself is going to Cabinet in the fall for approval. That's a bit of a moving target. It was supposed to go last fall. It was supposed to go this spring. I'll believe it when it happens, but at the moment, that's the plan, and that's why we're working towards a fall completion of our Water Conservation Policy Project. I think I'll leave it there for an implementation update, and we can open it up for questions. None, good. Yeah. You guys awake? No.
Is that one question on consensus? So it's unanimous, you said, or is it like 19 out of 20? How do you define consensus?
I'm going to back up half a step and then answer your question. So when we went into this process, the AER and AEP made it quite clear that at the end of the day, the AER is the decision maker on all of these issues and what happens. So if the group came to consensus, that was, and in this case, consensus was everybody was in agreement. If they did not come to agreement, then the AER would decide the route forward. So in this case, the AER, AEP, and all of the stakeholders were in agreement with these. There were no dissenting views. We didn't document a dissenting view. None of that.
And I'll add that, certainly there were plenty of dissenting views in the room. I would say, though, that we worked through items until everybody could live with what was there and felt comfortable taking it back to their own group to represent it. So, certainly there was a lot of swirl, and, the way we've presented these recommendations, it's at a very high level. And you'll see even in the reports, each recommendation is fairly succinct, but there was a lot of intention behind a lot of the wording, and there is quite a bit of nuance in there. And a lot of that was to really make sure the view was clear and represented everybody.
Scott, how does the AER differentiate between what they would qualify freshwater versus produced water? And we have a business where we treat a lot of freshwater, produced water, wellhead treating, oil production, whatnot. How do they differentiate that number?
So it's written into the Water Act has a TDS level, gets at 4,000. Yeah. So that's some of what we're exploring in the Water Conservation Policy Project piece, is a little bit how we can what options are there for calling something that is engineered. I think they're actually using the term engineered fluid at this point until it changes. To try and figure out some different categories. So it's not technically called water, it's an engineered fluid, so therefore maybe there's a different set of rules. That's what they're exploring in some of their regulatory analysis right now.
If the producer ever went to using low TDS produced fluid to complete wells through pressure pumping or whatnot, and then re-injected that back into the same reservoir, how would that look?
So if we were to forecast what this thing could look like using some of these recommendations as guidance. If we had something that was, say, equivalent to what could be released to the environment, maybe it's an engineered fluid, maybe it's been treated from high TDS down to low, that would be probably treated as a low-risk fluid, and you would have containment and conveyance requirements that match that risk sort of category. That's the intent of the entire framework. Where the AER has some challenge in figuring this out is we typically manage to the highest risk level because that's the easiest thing to do. And so as we delve into these sort of sub-layers, it gets more complicated. Compliance is a different issue. So that's a lot of what they're sort of mulling through right now. If you have a pond that has fluid in it, how do we know whether it's high or low? Can we test for this? Like, those are the kind of the discussions we're having.
Well, but to clarify on that, it's 4,000 unless it's come in contact with one drop of produced fluid.
That's correct, and that's some of the discussion. We have 10 statutes that we operate under, and sometimes under the Water Act, you have certain requirements. Changing the terminology allows us to maybe shift how it's handled. It's a fairly complicated question that we're trying to puzzle through. I expect that the Water Conservation Policy Project might actually be bringing in some of the industry subject folks to help with some of these discussions. That's what I've heard. I don't know if they have concrete plans yet. But the idea is to adhere to the concepts that we put forward in these recommendations around actually having regulatory requirements that match the risk. So if you're able to take high risk fluid down to low or medium, you should be able to build a different kind of containment. You won't have to go to, lined and monitored and all the requirements for high risk.
I think an important piece of that is that there's already a risk framework in place that would allow this sort of thing to occur, and that's Directive 50. It was specifically carved out for waste to be able to release it into the environment. So it's not, that's one of the frameworks I kept pressing here just because that's our bread and butter. But you do have the ability to take equivalent fluid that can't be disposed of, produced water for instance, that have equivalent characteristics of drilling waste and dispose of it into the environment. That would be a no-no. But that framework is there and it is possible.
I have another.
Yeah, go ahead.
Would the government support a pre-pilot proposal to store produced water or, say, transport produced water in lay flat hose?
I think we've entertained some options, some applications in the past. It's usually case by case. I don't know, I can't say for sure. Typically what happens is we'll get the applications and decide whether or not we can entertain it. It's a bit of a, it's a little bit like the reclaiming back to capable equivalent land capability. We do accept applications for keeping it as a pond. And that was some of the challenge, was that, all right, when do you and when don't you? Because that's not clear. And that was some of what that recommendation got to. So in answer to your question, you'd just have to ask whether something like that would work with our operations folks.
Do you want to repeat for everybody what you asked?
So you were asking whether or not there would be, the AER would consider pilot applications, so test applications, for moving, let's call it higher risk fluid through lay flat hose. Or storage, yeah. I think we have had some in the past, some applications. Yeah.
Did the panel discuss like any sort of technological improvements that could reduce the risk of transfer storage? Like is there, you know, something around the corner next generation that will allow movement of produced fluids in lay flat hose and a new type of lay flat hose? Did that come up in the discussions?
Sorry, I was going to jump in there.
Do you want to repeat it first, just in case?
So I just got to make sure I remember accordingly. She said I was supposed to repeat the question, but what the question was had to do with technological advancements to be able to move risk into a lower category. Would that kind of sum it up, right? What we found so far, so we tried to do something like this with another operator where we would end up taking high risk fluid and reduce that risk to a point of, which is what Catherine had mentioned, to a drinking water standard. Because it was classified as waste, there was no ability for us to store in an unlined pit, so just earth and containment. We couldn't transfer, and we couldn't end up disposing of it off-site. But the main driver for all of this is because there's no avenue to do what you're saying, is that technology has really had a hard time coping, in Alberta specifically. I guess the best way to put it is that if you were to dump a pile of R&D into something and not see any horizon with it whatsoever, that's really where this sits. Is there's a lot of people who have been dabbling in this to see if they could I guess it's not the exact word or best word, but peddle it to the government and say that this potentially could work or would work really, really well. It would come back and basically say that, well, that sounds like a great concept, but there's no avenue for you to get rid of it, so thanks for coming out. You may.
The way I would put it, because you were specifically asking too about the panel and whether we discussed it, and the general feeling was that the pace of technology had outstripped the pace of regulatory change. So it's just where we needed to focus for now.
There's one back here.
It's 23 recommendations, and I know there are two main categories. Outside of those categories, have the recommendations been prioritized?
The answer is yes. The priority has been put on the barriers. And actually the panel themselves prioritized the barriers sort of suite of recommendations, because the general feeling and discussion was that if you don't remove the barriers, the rest of it doesn't matter. You can have improved reporting, you can do all of these things. But the intent of this whole exercise was to essentially enable companies to use these alternate sources. And if we don't remove the barriers, as Catherine mentioned, and there's a few of them, the rest of it doesn't matter. Some of the barriers, some of the pieces are going to take longer than others, especially when we're talking policy change types of pieces. But the reason why some of our GOA folks were in agreement with some of this, because they've had those discussions. They know that in the back rooms in government, they're having the same discussions around interbasin, low-risk interbasin transfers and those types of things. The challenge becomes the elected officials, because any policy change at that level goes to elected officials, and they only have so much bandwidth for some of that.
Can I jump in for a sec?
Sure.
I just wanted to give you an example. So if you think about some of these discussions we had, we're talking about the basin regulatory framework and what that might look like. And hey, if we're becoming tight on allocation versus what's actually available, maybe the government might ask you to demonstrate how you're using alternatives. Well, wait a second. Right today, it would sound like a conversation about how I tried to use alternatives and wasn't allowed to, right? So I think that's at the heart of why, as a panel, we all really felt like if we don't address the actual guts of it, these regulatory barriers to actually pursuing these alternatives, the rest of it, some of it doesn't even make sense, right?
One other point I'll add to that, though, is actually having the policymakers, the ones who wrote that water conservation policy, in the room with us so that they could see that they had designed a policy for which the regulatory system didn't fit and that there was challenges and that we would actually need government's help to make changes to make the policy work. That's helpful for us. We'll see how that plays out. It was fairly clear in the room. Whether that translates to outside the multi-stakeholder panel, time will tell.
So that all ties into my question. You already identified it's complex, lots of issues. It sounds like lots of progress in the past. Now it's at ABR. The big step is still to get approved at cabinet, which obviously most people aren't really close to the issues. What are you guys doing to make sure when it gets to cabinet, they're ready to rubber stamp it instead of put it on hold?
So some of the work that we're taking on with this water conservation policy project, and actually even the contemplation of doing pilot applications, that has been at the request of the minister, so that when the policy comes forward for approval, she can say, actually, you guys have already tested some pieces of it, and I have the results, and it should make that go more quickly. I mean, the bottom line, and from my perspective, is that policy has been around for long enough now that it should be a rubber stamp. Our challenge, I would say because it's a royal hour in terms of the government and AER, it's getting time in front of government. The policy was on the docket last spring, and it was pushed off the docket. And then I believe it was put on again for this coming spring, but I think it's been pushed back to fall. So I'm hopeful that they put the time to it, but they have an awful lot of things on their plate for cabinet discussion, and I don't know. We won't know if it's going to get there until it gets there. The scheduling of that stuff isn't up to us. We're prepared for it to go, but I guess if you're speaking to your MLAs or your ministers, they need to know that some of this stuff is fairly important, and maybe that'll help it. Any other questions before lunch? Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Well, I feel like firstly we should give the speakers a round of applause. I think that's what we do. Secondly, I wanted to thank all of you for taking time of your day to join us. If there's anything that comes up following the event, please feel free to ask anyone from CLEAR or the other two speakers that are involved. If there's anyone else within your team that wasn't able to be a part of it, we'll make sure that they get the information. And again, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate you joining us.